Welcome to an SFB Addict video. Oh my god, this game takes so long to play! SFB Addict here. Basically just responding to a comment on one of the vids that Starfleet Battles just simply takes too long to play. Well, that really depends on how you're playing. Primarily, at its best, Starfleet Battles does best time-wise, and probably game enjoyment-wise, when you're playing as a two-player game with single-ship duels. And as you add players, and as you add ships, that time consumption will increase. And if really long games aren't your forte, then your enjoyment will decrease. Typically, I try to avoid games with more than 4 ships on a side. If we go to multiple players, I prefer to try and keep it to 1 ship per player. If you're going to try and do something like a 12-ship fleet versus a 12-ship fleet, the best way to do that is with 6 players on each side, playing 2 ships. Doing anything more than that, and you're just asking for the game to crawl to a slow pace. But the game itself, when played simply as a single ship duel between 2 players, typically will take less than 2 hours. In fact, the entire tournament setup has a time limit of 2 to 3 hours. Most games will end under 2 hours. If the later rounds, or if a game goes beyond the 2 hours and it comes to adjudication, the judges make a judgment call. They will look at the situation, and if something is clear that one player is winning, they'll call it at that point. And if it's a little bit ambiguous, they may give the players an additional hour to finish the game. But outside of that, there are other things that can be done to speed up the game. I actually have an entire video on speeding up the game, which is primarily focusing on movement patterns, having plans for your attack plan for the turn, for the overall game. But there are other things you can do to speed things up. For instance, when you're rolling internals, instead of just rolling them one at a time, you can grab a set of 10 dice and just roll the entire set for 10 internals, and then start grabbing those dice by color, no particular order, or if you want a specific order, you can use a rainbow sort of thing, and just start picking the colors and marking off the damage on your ship. But in addition to that, there are other things. The setup itself can be a little bit slow, so one of the things I recommend is that if you have a set gaming night, do your setup beforehand. I'm not talking about your energy allocations, I'm talking about what you're going to be playing that night. So if you have a set scenario that you're going to do, go ahead and do that. But if you're just doing a free pickup game kind of thing, you can nail down those particulars ahead of time, and if you don't really have a set thing that you want to do, you can do stuff randomly kind of thing. So this is a chart that I used to use. Basically, we would roll for the race that we're going to fly, and because not everybody was comfortable flying every race, we would give them sort of like 3 choices. So we would simply roll 1 to 6 kind of thing on a specific type of group. So if they had a particular favorite, they would say, I want to roll on group 2. And then they would roll for ISC, Tholane, or Fed. Or if they had a particular favorite of group 5, they would then roll for Orion, Centaurian, or LDR. Or if you didn't want to pick the group that you're going to roll under, you could just simply roll outright. And if you got a 6, you could then choose the particular race that you wanted. And then we would roll for where the location of the battle was happening, because that would determine whether or not we were going to be able to take special units. So again, we would roll on 1 of 6 locations, and if there was an Orion player present, we would then roll for what cartel at the above location that they would be allowed to take, and then we would get into the specials. So if you wanted to take a shock ship, a stasis cruiser, PFs without the PF tender, a minesweeper, a battle tug, then it must be at the location that was rolled above, and you had to roll 2d6 in order to be able to do it, and you had to roll something like a 3 or a 4 and then a 50% roll on top of that, or you had to roll a 2 or a 3 on those 2d6. And then if you were playing certain races like the Win, you had to take the fish ships or captured ships if it wasn't at the Win border location. If you wanted to use a monitor or a base or an FRD, again, that would be location dependent. And same thing for carriers, escorts without the carriers, prototypes, and if you even wanted to use legendary officers, you had to roll for it. And then we would roll for the time period. So we would roll for what section of time it was in, and then if we rolled the General War, then we would narrow down what time period in the General War, because drone speeds and things like that are dependent on that, and technology during the General War rapidly advances, so that would determine what refits we would have available. And then we would decide what type of battle we wanted to play. Did we want to play a single ship battle, or a multi-ship battle, or a big fleet? And then we would roll 1 to 6 to sort of pick what type of BPV level within that we wanted to play. So if we wanted to play multiple ships, and we ended up flying, or rolling 400, well, if you're trying to take 6 ships on 400, you're going to have a lot of frigates and destroyers. So we would actually set the number of ships that we were going to use before we would roll the BPV. And if we wanted to play a non-balanced game, we would each roll on the BPV. So if one player rolled a 4, then the next player was either going to get a 3, 4, or a 5. And they would do that by roll of a 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5, or 6. And then we had some hard and fast rules. For instance, if a particular volley of damage was to do more than, say, 40 points of damage, we would agree that half of the hull would be immediately marked as destroyed, and that deducted from the tally of damage. So if a ship had 4 forward hull, 4 aft hull, and then 8 center hull, we would immediately mark off 8 damage. If a volley was taking more than 60 internals, we would mark off all of the hull. And it of course helped if you were familiar with your ship and knew roughly where all your systems were. Now some people would resort to using chess timers to play. So if you had agreed ahead of time that you're going to do a 2-hour game, then you would set your clocks at 2 hours. Both people would do their energy allocations, and as soon as one player was completed, they would hit their chess timer and it would start running the timer for the opponent, counting down their clock. And the same thing would happen with the impulses. If an impulse is called, and once everything is done being moved, one player declares no actions, they would hit the clock and start running their opponent's clock. And as that player is sitting there thinking or actually declaring an action, then it runs their clock. And then of course there would always be the need to look up a rule. And most people are able to find the rules really quickly, but sometimes there are some rules where it can take a fair amount of time. So we would say if there's a need to look up a rule, you have 3 minutes in which to do that. And if you are unable to find the specific rule that you're looking for within that time period, then at that point it would just be whatever the majority opinion is, or if it's just the two of you playing, you would flip a coin or roll a die and go with that rule interpretation until the game is over, and then you could look up the rule later. And the last thing to consider for speeding up the game kind of thing is the size of the map and the size of the ship. If you take really small ships and you have a big floating map, then it's going to turn into a bit of a sniping game, because neither ship is going to have enough firepower to overwhelm and destroy their opponent in a single volley. But if you take small ships and use a small map with fixed borders that if you go beyond you disengage, then suddenly you don't have space to run, and it forces the engagement. This is actually one of the primary reasons the cadet module typically uses only 2 panels, which are roughly 15 by 14 hexes wide. They are small ships, and you play it on a small map, and the game proceeds rather quickly. One of the things a lot of people just seem to forget is that the game can be played with multiple impulse charts. You can play an 8 impulse game, a 16 impulse game, or a 32 impulse game. Now the 8 impulse game is really only meant for Cadet, but the 16 and 32 charts can be used for both Cadet and the full game. So if you use the full scale ships on a 16 impulse chart, it really does speed the game up. But it does change the flavor of the tactics. So if you truly are concerned about how long a game will take, then you need to take some proactive steps to mitigate that. This of course does go a little bit easier if you're constantly playing with a predefined group of people. But anyway, that's all I have to say on speeding up the game, so have fun playing Starfleet Battles.